Hi, I'm Daniela Cruz, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Kimbell Art Museum, and I speak with curator George Shackelford about their exhibition, Monet, the Late Years. Now for Art This Week. I'm here with George Shackelford at the Kimbell Art Museum to talk about the exhibition, Monet, the Late Years. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So this is a sequel to an exhibition you curated some years ago featuring Monet's early works. Can you talk about curating that first exhibition and then how this exhibition came about?
Well, the two of them came about simultaneously, actually. Eric Lee, director of the Kimbell, and I were having lunch one day in our buffet, recommend it to you, and we could see our late Monet, Weeping Willow, from about 1918. We could see it while we were having lunch. And Eric said, why don't we do a show about Monet's Weeping Willows? And knowing Monet's work, well, I said, there's not enough of them actually to make a complete Weeping Willow show, but why don't we do Weeping Willows in the context of Monet's late work? And then I thought, while we're at it, why don't we do Monet's early work too? Because the Kimbell owns two paintings by Monet. One painted when he's 24 and the other painted when he's 78. So it seemed a good idea to do young man, old man.
During this time he was living in Giverny in his estate. How did his property and his gardens and kind of the evolution of that influence his work?
Well, they became the real subject for his work. We're talking about the end of his life when he moves to Giverny in the 1880s. He buys the property in the 1890s. He expands it in around 1900, and it becomes really the center for his art at that time. And the period that we're talking about, which is really concentrating on the years 1914 to 1926 when he dies, it's the only subject that he paints. The pond and the areas of the garden surrounding the pond and the house are really his world at that time, and plenty of inspiration for him to paint some of the most remarkable pictures of his whole career.
So he did start painting in series in 1891, and we see this continued in this exhibit with paintings of water lilies, the willows, as well as the Japanese bridge. Do we know why he started doing this and kind of how this came about?
Well, in the 1890s, I think it was both an intellectual challenge to take a single subject and to see how many variations you could make of it, exploiting different conditions of light and atmosphere. So that was the fundamental goal of it. But then it also becomes an important marketing device. And if you do an exhibition based on a particular series, it gets a lot of attention, and that it did certainly do that for Monet. So that in 1909, when he did perhaps the most successful of all of his series exhibitions on water lilies, he had it down in a way. And that habit of painting, that habit of thinking, then was one that was natural to him from then on. And he always painted from then on, he always painted things that were like each other and groups of things. And he liked to paint a similar idea many times in order to see how many changes he could wring out of it.
Right, it's really incredible to see the different renditions of the Japanese bridge and how that's kind of morphed over time and during the different periods, so it's incredible.
True, and it's true, and we also see in that particular series, I know you'll have noticed that it's almost like you could order one in many different colors. There's a kind of a lime green one and a blue green one and a kind of purpley one and a more bluish one. And we know that part of that is his will to vary them, but also part of it we wonder what role his changing eyesight plays, because he was in fact struggling with cataracts, and we know that cataracts are something that really definitely distort and in a changing way affect your color vision.
And thinking about the challenges that he overcame in the periods from 1910 to 1914, after the death of his wife, his eldest son, his failing vision, and with the war, that really affected him. How did that affect his painting?
Well, for a time, largely between about 1910, when his wife gets really ill, and 1914, when he has a sudden burst of energy. The number of paintings that he actually makes is very, very small. He finishes some that he had begun in 1908, but he doesn't generate a lot of new work. And and part of it is, in fact, as you say, the death of Alice, his second wife, the death of his son Jean, who is an invalid for about a year and a half. It's really after Jean's death that he begins to paint, and it's only then after that that the war begins. But the war is the backdrop to virtually this whole exhibition.
Right.
And it begins in the summer, the end of the summer of 1914, which is just when the new spurt of energy begins for him. And it extends to the Weeping Willows of 1918, which are really coincide with the armistice and the end of the war. And they, as symbols of mourning, have a really profound meaning for him at that time.
And in some of these later works, we do see a change in the size of his canvas, the style, and very much the application of brushstrokes. Can you talk about that and where it's visible in some of these paintings?
Well, in the way we present the exhibition, in our largest galleries, we've put the largest paintings. And in a smaller gallery, we've put the smaller paintings, and they fit, I think, quite nicely. It is, I want you to remember, though, that they're actually sometimes happening simultaneously, and that paintings that we know are bigger and bolder are sometimes happening at the same time that he's painting somewhat more intense and intimate paintings. But he is able to move back and forth between these two formats, between a format where something might be 6 by 6 feet, or a format where something might be 2 by 2 feet. So it's really a big shift, and at the same time he brings the same amount of almost intensity to each one. It becomes a little bit more concentrated when the format goes smaller. It's bigger and bolder, and it feels more open, and then you look at the smaller paintings and it gets more intense, more distilled in a way.
It's really incredible to see the variation with the size and, like you said, this intensity that comes out.
Yes.
So some of his works, and you'll notice it in the exhibit, they kind of, the horizon line just seems to disappear.
Yes.
It's like not a focus. Why was that, and did he ever talk about his use of the horizon line, or more so the disappearing of that with?
Well, it's very interesting. In most of this exhibition, particularly when he's dealing with the pond, he does not look up. He's standing on the side of the pond, and he focuses his vision, he frames his vision so that he doesn't take the opposite bank into account. And therefore what you're seeing in the image is the reflection of the world beyond on the surface of the water. So he's painting the world as if he's looking at it all through into a mirror. And it's a very effective means of slightly challenging your perception of space.
Right.
So that when you come to look at these paintings, you often, I don't want to say you don't know which end is up,
Right.
but I would note something to you. A lot of people turn these paintings upside down by accident.
Wow.
You know, when they're looking at them in a postcard or on a sheet of paper. And it's very hard sometimes to not realize that you flipped the thing. So interestingly do they work in both directions.
During this time period of his 70s and 80s, was he surrounded with other artists? I know that in his earlier Impressionist years, he had a lot of contemporaries that he worked with. How was his working style and relationships at that time?
He was, in this period, he was much, much more private. And I don't mean exclusively private, but for instance, his closest friends amongst the Impressionists, among them were Pissarro and Sisley. Well, they were both gone. And he was never particularly close friends with Degas, but Degas dies in 1917. Renoir, to whom he was very close, lives in the south of France, and he dies in 1919. So Monet survives all of these others of his contemporaries. Everyone else is gone. And he is isolated from them. However, he receives visits from the young artists, and you get an artist like Matisse, who particularly asks to be introduced. You then have the artist Bonnard, who buys a property about 5 or 6 miles away from Monet and is a frequent visitor in both directions in the last years of Monet's life. So I think that you find a kind of conviviality there. And he was also intensely close to politicians and writers and musicians. And so you have Clemenceau, the great politician. You have Gustave Geoffroy, who's a critic and novelist. You have a great singer coming to give a recital for Monet in his studio. And I think you find that he's not antisocial at all, and serves a very good lunch at his dining table.
Wow, it seems like he had a really great relationship with those around him in his later years.
He certainly did, yes.
And can you talk a little bit about some of these works? They were made and obviously are now in galleries, but how were they created in relation to what is called his masterwork, the Grandes Décorations?
Right. Well, from 1914 on, he had in mind the notion of creating a really big series of paintings that would be public, that would be a painting you could walk into, in a way, displayed in a room so that they would surround you and give you a sense of immersion in the subject. And the subject was going to be the water lily pond. Now, to make those big paintings, he had to make lots of studies, and the studies were of a portable scale, that they would be maybe 6 feet tall, but they would only be 5 feet wide, and they could be carried back and forth from studio to pond to studio to pond, and be works of reference for the larger decorations. The big paintings were only revealed after Monet died. And what we have in this exhibition, since those are glued to the wall in Paris, what we have in this exhibition are many of the studies that were related to them, or paintings that were made simultaneously that were never necessarily destined to go into that bigger installation. So we managed to give you the sense of scale that Monet was working on by having paintings like the ones that are behind us that are far bigger than we are. We get that sense of scale in this exhibition in spite of the limitations of what is actually mobile. And so with 52 paintings ranging in date from 1897 to about 1924-25, we really managed to cover this period with most of everything dating after 1914.
Can we talk a little bit about, or can you tell me about the painting and the quality of the brushstrokes as his vision failed and kind of how that evolved?
First of all, when Monet decided to start painting big, everything got bigger simultaneously. And so the canvases got bigger, the number of tubes of paint that he needed got bigger, larger. He needed bigger brushes, he wanted bigger brushes. And so there's a physical difference between a painting that's made even in 1913 and one that's made in 1914. They're just different. Then one of the things that we see in this exhibition is also huge disparities between some paintings that are painted very thinly and with a lot of immediacy, and others that are painted with multiple layers and changes of mind, and whole groupings of flowers that have been eliminated and turned into plain water, for instance. So there's a lot to see even with the naked eye beneath the visible surface. I mean, I think you can perceive looking at some of these paintings that the textures that they have reveal a lot of alteration over time. You're very aware of Monet, the art maker in this exhibition. One of the joys, however, is that with some scientific research, my colleague Claire Barry in the catalog of the exhibition is able to tell you a lot more about the composition of his paints and which kinds of colors he was using and how he was treating the tube paint to make it different from how it came out of the tube, for instance. So there's a lot of interesting research and discovery that goes into this exhibition that for those who are interested in technical details, there's a lot to learn.
How did critics and viewers of this work, when it was being made, that was being released, how did they view this work?
Well, the initial section of the exhibition with the water lilies shown in 1919, those were received with rave reviews. Very few people saw and were able to write about the later period because Monet was careful to guard his privacy, and he wanted a reveal. He wanted there to be a big surprise when the big decorations opened. Well, he never saw that happen. And when a few people were able to secure works from his studio, if they dared to exhibit them, he was not very happy because he wanted it to be kind of a secret. Also at this period, there were many people who very much admired the biggest of the paintings. He turned down a multi-million-dollar offer from an American industrialist to buy the whole lot. So he knew that those would have been initially very valuable. But when he sold the smaller paintings, interestingly enough, they were often not very much desired by the buying public. And so it's a very interesting thing that most of what you see now was considered, I don't want to say worthless, but of much less importance, much lower importance at the time that Monet died. And it's really only in the last 70 years or so, since World War II, and since the realization that many of the effects that Monet achieves are like those that were achieved by our modern painters. When we see that relationship, we have come to value late Monet more. And so it's in projects like this one that we still are able to surprise people who aren't used to seeing so much of this material.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
We want to thank George for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to kimbellart.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.